Hello. Today I would like to begin my thoughts by reading a portion of text from the book of James that I am confident will be relevant to most anyone who watches this video. I know it's a text that is certainly relevant to me personally and quite frankly just a little bit painful as I ponder my own shortcomings with regard to what James speaks of in the text that I want to look at. I'm talking about what James has to say with regard to the tongue in the 3rd chapter of his letter, in James chapter 3. So if you've got a Bible handy, by all means you're welcome to follow along with me as I read from the book of James. James, of course, is in the New Testament, in the latter part of the New Testament, right after the book of Hebrews, right before the book of 1 Peter. And so we're going to be reading in James chapter 3, and I'm actually going to start reading in verse 2, and I'll go ahead and read on down through verse 12. So beginning there, it is written, "We all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Though they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so the tongue is a little member that boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, the world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh." So what James does here is he speaks of the need to control one's tongue, one's speech, in other words. But he also spends the majority of the text that we just read here, he spends the majority of this passage talking about what a challenge this is. What a challenge it is to control one's tongue. Because though it is a small member, a very small part of our overall human body, it is nevertheless capable of significant impact. As James knows, you've got a horse, a very large animal, and yet it is controlled by a very small thing, that little bit that we put in its mouth, and we're able to turn it and make it go wherever we want it to go. Similarly, a ship, very large object, but its course is determined by the rudder, which again, relative to the ship as a whole, is a very small part of the ship. The human tongue, despite its small size, is likewise capable of doing significant things. It can do great things, to be sure. You know, it is by the human tongue that God has decided that the gospel message would be delivered to mankind. So the tongue can be the source of good things, the source of great encouragement if used properly. But the tongue is also capable of great harm and great destruction as well. Verses 5 and 6 of the text that we just read compare it to how a great forest can be consumed by a fire that begins with just a little fire that is lit within it. The tongue, if not controlled, can cause damage that is every bit as devastating as that. It must be controlled. It must be controlled because it cannot be tamed. You know, you can tame an animal. A wild animal, not tamed, that can pose a threat to people. I guess it can pose a threat to property too. It can be a threat if it's allowed to be in the midst of people, in the midst of things that are valuable to us, because it might harm such things just by doing the things that a wild animal does. Now, if you're going to have a wild animal among people, now you've got to have some way and take some steps to bring it and keep it under control, because it will not control itself. Now, if the animal is tame, well, you can probably put in a tame animal among people without much supervision, and it won't cause a whole lot of problems. It will not be a threat. Many of us know this to be true. We live this truth on a daily basis. We have animals that live among us, don't we? We have pets. We've got animals living at my house at home. And they are all perfectly safe around people. Although I have my thoughts about that cat sometimes. But anyway, our pets, which are animals, are safe because they are tamed. They have been tamed. If they weren't tamed, we would have to constantly control them. And that's a significant difference between that which is tame and that which is not tame. But after noting that every kind of animal has been tamed, James notes that the tongue has not. In fact, what he says about the tongue is that it cannot be tamed. It is always a potential threat to cause harm. It cannot be tamed, so it must be controlled. And a lot of diligence is required because keeping the tongue under control is quite a challenge for many of us. And I did say us. I include myself in that number as well. It is so easy to cause great harm with our tongue. We must take great care with it, with our words. I mentioned a moment ago that the tongue can do both good things and bad things. Well, verses 9 and 10 of the text that we read a moment ago from James 3 bear this out. As James notes that with our tongues, we bless our God. And we curse, we wish evil upon, or we invoke evil upon our fellow man. Men who have been created in the similitude, in the image of God. Out of the same mouth, from the same tongue, one will praise God and then turn around and curse God's grandest creation, that which he has made in his own image. And you see, did you notice what James said about that in our text in verse 10? He said, "My brethren, these things ought not to be so." And I imagine that any rational human, really, if he or she is honest with him or herself, I think most all of us would know that intuitively, that we shouldn't be blessing God on the one hand and cursing man on the other. But in case anyone doesn't know it intuitively, James makes it very clear in this passage. Like a wild animal or a small fire, perhaps a campfire that is lit in the woods, like it cannot be unsupervised because of the harm that it might cause, even so the tongue must be supervised and kept under control as well. Again, because we cannot tame it, we must control it. Earlier in this letter, James links the necessity of controlling one's tongue to the practice of good religion. If you turn back to the first chapter of James, in James chapter 1 and verse 26, he writes there, "If anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless." It truly is amazing to think of what a detrimental effect the tongue can have on people if it is not properly controlled. It is amazing and it is sobering. It's something that every person needs to get a handle on if we are going to be right with the Lord. As challenging as it is, it's something we need to pay attention to. And it is challenging. And it is challenging, I believe, at least in part, because sins of the tongue can take on different forms. And maybe while we're being real diligent to avoid sinning in one particular way, maybe we're slipping up in this other way. And so what I want to do, the remaining of our time together today, is to take note of 5 types of sin that can be committed with the tongue, so as to hopefully help us all in our attempts to bring our tongues under control and to be more pleasing as servants of God. Now the first sin of the tongue that I will speak with you about today is probably the one that most quickly comes to people's minds when we think about sins of the tongue. I'm talking about profanity. Profane language that is not appropriate. Certainly as our society in general coarsens, and it is becoming very coarse, this is becoming more and more of a problem with non-Christians and the unchurched, as we sometimes call them. But let's just be honest about this thing. This can be a challenge for Christians as well, Because after all, we live in this society, don't we? We hear things all the time, whether we like it or not, whether we realize it or not. What we hear others doing in this regard can and often does have an effect on us. That may be that maybe the first time we hear language, bad language used, whatever point in life we were at when we hear it for the first time, maybe that shocks us. But then as time goes by, we hear it more and more, and we grow accustomed to hearing it. And then we get to the point where it doesn't shock us, and it doesn't bother us that much anymore. Well, if we get to the point where it doesn't bother us, we better start being very, very careful. Because when it stops bothering us to hear it, well, it's not a far jump to get to the point where it doesn't bother us to maybe mutter something under our breath that we shouldn't. And from there to just openly saying things and using terms and phrases that we know we really ought not to be using. I remember, it's been years ago now, but I remember seeing an article about an actor, I believe, a movie star, who said that he refused to take the Lord's name in vain. If he was in some kind of a show where they called on him to do that, he just wouldn't do it. See, he was aware that Exodus chapter 20 and verse 7, for example, said in so many words, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Of course, that was stated as God declared the 10 Commandments to the people of Israel. What are the 10 Commandments? Well, as I put it to the folks here at the church where I preach, that was the very core of the law. The 10 Commandments were the core of the law. These 10 principles that were laid out on those tables of stone. And so God stated in the very core of the law that you are not to take his name in vain. And so you know that it matters to God. And this actor's thinking was that if God specifically forbade that kind of speech, taking his name in vain, well, then he wouldn't do it. Thing is, I know that this person didn't have and doesn't have problems using other words that are really inappropriate, other words and phrases that are not good. And let's face it, let's be honest, there are such terms that even society, even people out in the world recognize as being bad language, as being vulgar and profane. You think about it. A lot of times, the ratings that are attached to movies or television shows, in part, will be based on the language. They know that there's some types of language, some terms that are not appropriate for all audiences. And so even society recognizes that there are some things that are just not as generally acceptable to say. And so if that's the case, then we recognize that it's not just taking the Lord's name in vain that people recognize as being bad language. Not only that, the fact of the matter is, taking God's name in vain is not the only specific form of speech that is forbidden in the Scriptures. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8, Paul writes there, "But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth." The term Paul uses there in Colossians 3 that is translated filthy language or maybe filthy communication, that term has reference to vile or morally despicable conversation. Now, frankly, that could refer to subject matter as well, but it certainly would refer to words that are considered to be morally despicable, even by society in general. Paul says that such things as this are to be put away from us. You know, when I was growing up, I remember hearing that a dirty mouth is a sign of a weak vocabulary. Personally, I think there's something to that. But more importantly, a dirty, a profane mouth is displeasing to God. We need to guard our tongues and not use them to speak such things. But as I noted, that is not the only form that sinning with the tongue can take. It can also take the form of slander, speaking slander. And so slander is another sin of the tongue that we need to guard against committing. Slander is defined as utterances of false charges or misrepresentations which defame and damage another person's reputation. Now, I hope we all realize that speaking any falsehood in any context is displeasing to God. although I am aware that among men, many have reasoned their way into justifying speaking falsehoods under certain circumstances. I'm not saying that I agree with that. In fact, I don't agree with that. All I'm saying is that there are some who feel like they can justify lying, at times anyway. But I'll tell you what, I would think that pretty much anyone who has even a hint of a moral compass about them would agree that falsehoods that are told for the purpose of harming someone or their reputation, that's something that ought not to be done. Pretty much anyone ought to be able to recognize that. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul writes of perilous times that would come upon the world in the last days. The last days, by the way, are the era in which we are now living. But in this passage in 2 Timothy 3, Paul writes of many of the sinful things that men would be engaging in those times. And in verse 3 of that text, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3, in the midst of this list of sins that would become prevalent in these perilous last days, Paul writes of those who are unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good. People who engage in slander in this passage are grouped with some pretty bad company. Because slander is a bad thing that no one, and certainly nobody who wears the name of Christian, ought to have a part in. It should never be our purpose to tear someone down. And we should certainly never speak falsehoods against a person for whatever reason. Now, I realize sometimes people will say, well, I didn't know it was false when I said it. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what else you didn't know. You didn't know it was true either, did you? Because you can't know that it's true if it's not true. And if you don't know that it's true, why would you utter it anyway if you can't confirm that it is true? In Proverbs chapter 10, and verse 18, Solomon writes, whoever hides hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. You know why anyone who spreads slander is a fool? The chief reason will be that it displeases God to spread slander. So we should never use our tongues to do this. Slander is another sin of the tongue that we must avoid. Neither should we use our tongues to gossip. This is another sin that is very common, unfortunately, that people commit with their tongue. Now, I realize some people may hear me say this and say, didn't we just cover that? We talked about slander and speaking falsehoods about people. Doesn't that cover gossip as well? Well, no, it doesn't, actually. Gossip is not the same as slander. Now, I know some people take the attitude that, well, if it's true, then it's not gossip. And that's just not right. That's not a correct statement to make. The definition of gossip is not specific to falsehoods. It simply has to do with revealing personal or sensational facts about others. Now, maybe what is said is not true, which would make it slander as well. But maybe what is said is true. Still, the question needs to be asked, true or not, what need do I have in passing this information along? What is my purpose? What is my reason for passing it along? The fact of the matter is, the word gossip doesn't appear that many times in the pages of the Bible. But there are other terms in the pages of the Bible that do appear that mean the same thing. One such term is talebearer. For example, in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 16, the law of Moses stated there, you shall not go about as a talebearer among your people, nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So you're not to be a talebearer among the people. And the term that is used there, talebearer, literally means scandal monger. As in someone who goes about spreading information for the purpose of creating scandal. Well, the law of Moses said, don't do this, regardless of whether it's true or not. Not only that, but I think most of us are aware that people who are known as talebearers or gossips are generally not regarded as highly trustworthy people or as highly trustworthy friends. Again, in the book of Proverbs, in chapter 11 and verse 13, Solomon writes there, a talebearer, there's that term again, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. There are some facts about people that the whole world does not need to be privy to. And if you want someone to lose trust in you real fast, and you want to alienate someone real fast, you just go ahead and tell something like this that you may know about them for no legitimate reason. And I'll tell you what, not only will the person you reveal the information about no longer trust you, but I imagine those to whom you reveal it, they might be kind of hesitant to get too close to you themselves. But again, regardless of what it does to our relationships, what's more important than that is the effect that it has on our relationship with God. This is a behavior that does not sit well with the Lord. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, as Paul wrote there of how the church is to deal with widows in its midst, he gives some warnings regarding younger widows. And in verse 13 of that text, in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13, he talks about the dangers that confront a young widow. And among the dangers confronting these younger widows is the possibility, verse 13, of them becoming idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Tell you what, people, real people, have been genuinely hurt by things that were true, but that did not need to be made general knowledge. I am aware of a specific situation years ago where someone in a church became aware of something that someone else in the church had done years prior to that. It was something sinful, but the person who had committed the sin had acknowledged the sin and had done all that they could to make it right with the Lord as well as with the aggrieved parties. Nevertheless, a few years later, this other person comes into the church, becomes aware of it, and proceeds to talk to people about it. And there were some problems that arose, and there was a lot of hurt and a lot of pain that was endured needlessly. Yes, what was said was true, it was factual, but it was a matter that all who were directly involved in it regarded as being over and done. A thing of the past that, quite frankly, had been resolved. What possible legitimate reason could the person have had for going out and telling others about this thing that they had learned? Does anyone really think that it was for the purpose of building up the church or anyone in it? You know, sometimes whether something that we learn is true or not is not the only question that we need to ask about it before telling it to others. No, we also need to ask, is it really necessary? Is it needful for me to share this with others? We need to think about why we think it is important to do so, if it really is important to do so. So gossip, that's another form that a sin of the tongue might take. And it can bring about terrible, terrible damage. We must learn to control our tongues to prevent this from happening. And even beyond those words of gossip, factual or not, that are said simply to evoke scandal, we might think about another way in which we can sin with the tongue, and that is by the utterance of idle words. Now, that is a term that Jesus himself used back in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 36. There, the Lord said, "But I say to you that for every idle word that men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment." Now, he says this in the midst of his response to certain accusations that had been made against him by Pharisees that were present at that time. You see, what he had done, he had just cast a demon out of a man, and in so doing had restored the man's sight and his ability to speak. And yet the Pharisees that were present, because they were determined not to believe in Jesus, no matter what he did, accused him of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, which was a silly accusation to make. Well, this is what prompted Jesus' response, which included what he said about idle words. And the term there that the Lord uses, idle words, has reference to useless words. They served no useful purpose and were spoken solely for the purpose of undermining him and clouding people's interpretation of the truth of what had just happened. We might say they said this just to be difficult. In fact, the intent of those speakers, of those Pharisees, was to distort, in the eyes of others, what had actually happened. Not to help the people understand that, in fact, the Son of God had just performed a miracle by the power of God. You know, I have been involved in Bible studies, group Bible studies, both as a leader of the study, but also I've witnessed studies that somebody else was leading where this happened. There would be someone present who, it seems that their sole purpose in being there was to undermine whatever the teacher was trying to say, whatever he was trying to teach. In other words, it seemed like their sole purpose there was to make the understanding of the subject needlessly difficult and undermining what the teacher was trying to get across. How serious do you suppose it is in the eyes of God for a person to stand in the way of those who are trying to understand the truth as it is being taught to them? Speaking words that serve no useful purpose. We're not talking about trying to correct error that's been spoken and point to the truth. Only words that are spoken to undermine either the message or the messenger. What we're talking about are not words that are designed to encourage anyone present in the ways of the truth. But you know what Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29? By inspiration, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." Now, the word that Paul uses here in this verse is corrupt, as in let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. That is not the same term that Jesus used in Matthew 12 when he talked about idle words, but the meaning is basically the same. It has to do with worthless words. Don't speak worthless or idle words, Paul says here. Speak words that will build people up and help them to understand and to do God's will. And finally, I want to mention one other sin of the tongue that we need to be aware of, and it is one that we do not think of probably as often when we hear the term sins of the tongue. But going back to our text in James chapter 3, now when we read that text at the outset of the study, you probably noticed that we did not start in verse 1 of the chapter. We actually started in verse 2 of James chapter 3, where James starts to talk about all that the tongue is capable of doing, for good or ill. But what I want to take note of now is that what he says beginning in verse 2, he connects back to what he said in verse 1. Verse 2 actually begins with the word for, which points back to what he's just said. And what he says in verse 1 is, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we will receive the stricter judgment." It's a very serious responsibility, and a very serious thing to take on the responsibility as a teacher of God's Word. Thinking about all that we've said and all that we've been noting so far about sinning with the tongue, with regard to what is said in verse 1 of James 3, I am reminded of how much damage can be done by a single false or erroneous teacher. Whether he is sincerely mistaken in what he teaches or he's knowingly teaching what is not right. Great damage can be done by a single teacher. Many religions today that oppose the truth of the gospel can be traced back to a single teacher, And many, what we might call branches of Christianity, for lack of a better term, many of these branches of Christianity that have strayed from the purity and simplicity of the gospel can similarly trace their roots back to a single or a few erroneous teachers. In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1, we're told there, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." And Paul writes in Titus chapter 1 and verse 11, there are some whose mouths need to be stopped because they're teaching what is not right. Certainly, generally when we think about this fact of life in the world, we're aware that those who sincerely desire to follow the Lord have a responsibility to verify what they are taught against what God has said. But the thought also occurs to me that as a teacher, I need to check up on myself and the things that I'm teaching so that I can ensure that I will be found not to be sinning against God by proclaiming that which is not true in His name. This is a sin of the tongue that is every bit as dangerous as any of the others. And we should strive to stay clear of them all. But this one is certainly a dangerous one, not only for the one who commits it, but also for those who hear it as well. We need to steer clear of this, those of us that have taken on the responsibility of teaching God's Word. Like so many things in this world and so many things about humans, the tongue is something that is capable of great good and great harm. Good will come of our use of the tongue if we are diligent to keep our tongues under control and to avoid their misuse. Misuse such as in the ways that we've looked at today. Well, I hope that these thoughts will be a help to you as you try to live a life that is pleasing to the Lord, and I hope that they will be an encouragement to everyone to continue to strive to grow in the Lord so that we will rise above sin in any form and be found fit for that upper and better kingdom that the Lord desires us to join Him in when this life is over. I appreciate you listening. Hope you have a good day.